Not long after the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period of Japan ended, Japan closed its borders to most foreigners and enacted laws banning its citizens from traveling overseas. This isolationist policy is commonly known as the Sakoku policy, which coincided with most part of the Edo period. The policy ended only after Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships opened up Japan with his gunboat diplomacy. But have you ever wondered how in the world did they manage to communicate if Japan had been completely isolated for over 200 years? In this episode, we will look at the origin of Kokugaku, the study of Japanese nativism, and Rangaku, the Japanese study of Dutch technology. The term Sakoku was only coined in 1801 when Rangaku scholar Shizuki Tadao translated Engelbert Kaempfer's book on the history of Japan. Engelbert was a German naturalist and physician who traveled to Japan along with the Dutch traders, the only group of Westerners who were allowed to trade with Japan. From his perspective, Japan would definitely seem like a locked country, but for the Japanese at the time the policy was implemented, it was just a sound protectionist policy that granted them centuries of peace. Despite the fact that their citizens were not allowed to travel abroad, they could pretty much get everything they needed from the 4 trading gateways that were set up. The Matsumae Gateway was in charge of trade with the Ainu people of Hokkaido. At the time, the island was not fully incorporated into Japan yet, so they are pretty much considered foreigners. Satsuma was in charge of trade with the kingdom of Ryukyu. Its main island was Okinawa. At the time, Ryukyu was a vassal of the Satsuma clan, but it was still a separate country from Japan. Tsushima was in charge of trade with Joseon Korea, and the port city of Nagasaki was in charge of trade with China and the Dutch. However, the visitors' movement was strictly limited to the artificial island of Dejima, just off the coast. So from their perspective, there was still quite a lot of interaction with the outside world. That's why nowadays, some Japanese scholars are pushing to change the term to kaikin, the same term used by China and Korea for their maritime restriction policy. There were a few different reasons why Japan restricted trade with Westerners besides the Dutch. One of the most commonly cited reasons was because at the time, they feared the influence of Catholicism, which was propagated by the Spanish and Portuguese. Their conversion of the locals into Catholicism and then using them to overthrow the local government was the standard conquistador modus operandi at the time. This tactic was used in the Americas and also Japan's neighboring island of Philippines. In 1596, during the San Felipe incident, one of the crew members of the Spanish fleet even used the idea to threaten the Japanese officials. Thus, the restriction became progressively more severe. Then, in 1637, the Shimabara Rebellion occurred, where a group of Christians and Ronins rebelled against the local government. After the rebellion was quashed, the Tokugawa shogunate just restricted everyone besides the Dutch from trading. Well now, here is an interesting question. How did the Dutch get this special privilege? Well, the Protestant Dutch at the time were better at separating trade with missionary work. Not only that, they were affiliated with William Adams when he was still alive, and they had also backed the Tokugawa side during the Sengoku period. So they pretty much picked the right winner. Consequently, the Dutch became their only window to the Western world. That's why the study of Western technology was called Rangaku, the abbreviation of Oranda Gaku, or the study of Holland things. At first, it was considered as a form of curiosity, because initially, the Japanese were more interested in Chinese literature and traditional Chinese medicine. But that will all eventually change, because a very significant event happened just next door. China's Ming Dynasty was overthrown and the Manchu Qin Dynasty came into power. Because Japan was nominally subscribed to the Confucian worldview, they virtually saw the world order turned upside down, as China was conquered by the Manchu people, which they all considered to be barbarians. In turn, they argued China had also become barbarian. This theory was called Ka-I Hentai. Despite the animosity of the failed invasion of China during the Imjin War, Japan actually saw the Ming Dynasty as the legitimate ruler of China. In their illustrated book of various nationalities, the Ming and Qing Chinese were put in separate categories. One of the most popular bunraku puppet show at the time was the Battle of Koxinga, which was based on Zheng Chenggong, the Ming loyalist who resisted the Qin Dynasty. Japan even made the rare exception of accepting foreigners into the country, as they allowed some Ming refugees to settle in Japan. And among those refugees was the Confucian scholar Zhu Ziyu, who was more commonly known in Japan as Shu Sunsui. He was invited to teach in the province of Mito by the daimyo Tokugawa Mitsuguni, and his students eventually developed Japan's own historical framework. With China losing its prestige very quickly, Japan started to develop its own historical, moral, and national identity, using the examples of the ancient Japanese figures instead of ancient Chinese figures like Confucianism does. This movement was called Mitogaku, which eventually led to Kogaku and then Kokugaku. Kokugaku stresses on the distinctiveness of the Japanese character and identity, especially in relation to China. Nevertheless, Chinese books still had its value, and classical Chinese was still the language of the literati. The first Western books to be translated would be translated into classical Chinese. Kokugaku and Rangaku are often considered to be the most important intellectual developments of the Edo period. But Rangaku flourished slightly later. At the beginning, the study was limited to the Dutch translators at Nagasaki. But from 1720 onwards, things started to change. Tokugawa Yoshimune relaxed the restriction on the importation of foreign books because he wanted to broaden the country's knowledge base. This started an influx of Dutch books coming into Japan along with Chinese classics. Then, not much happened until the 1770s. In 1771, Tokugawa physician Sugita Genpaku came to possess a copy of the German anatomy book that was translated into Dutch, Onthele Kunge Tafle. After comparing the illustration in the book to the dissected anatomy of an executed criminal, they marveled at its accuracy. It was much more accurate than the diagrams found in books on traditional Chinese medicine. So he and his friends Maino Ryotaku and Junan Nakagawa started a project to translate the book into Japanese. The result was imperfect due to Maino's limited Dutch language skills. But still, it was the first ever fully translated Western book, Kaitai Shinsho, which was published in 1774. Following the release of this book, interest in Rangaku grew rapidly. Later on, Sugita would write a book on the beginnings of Rangaku study in Japan and published Rangaku Kotohajime. He may have thought that he was the pioneer, but the fact is, there are people in Nagasaki who did it before him. Maybe he just didn't know, or because he was just more influential because he lived in Edo, which was the de facto capital of Japan at the time. From medicine, Rangaku moved on to the various sciences, and more books were translated. Various Westerners who came along with the Dutch, such as the Swedish naturalist Carl Peter Thunberg and German physician Philipp Franz von Siebold, helped in the study of Rangaku greatly. Siebold's daughter with a Japanese woman then went on to become the first female doctor in Japan, Kusumoto Ine. Unfortunately for him, he was caught with a Japanese map in his possession, an innocent gift from a Japanese friend. But it became a very grave national security matter, because it was highly illegal to take a map out of Japan, which may be used to plan an invasion. This Siebold incident nearly ended the Rangaku movement. Medicine and scientific progress is fine and all, but when it comes to political issues, it is non-negotiable. Even for Japanese citizens themselves, who were often punished more severely, such as Siebold's friends and associates. There were actually internal demands to end Sakoku. One of those people was Hayashi Shihei, a Japanese military scholar. Having inspected Japan's various defense lines, and after corresponding with various Rangaku scholars, he argued that the Sakoku policy must end, and they needed to modernize their army with Western technology against possible external threats such as China or Russia. In 1787, he published a 16-volume book, Kaikoku Heidan, which garnered a lot of interest. But instead of change, he was put under house arrest in 1792 and died the following year. Half a century later, Japan received a shock in their system when they received news of China's defeat in the First Opium War. So in 1842, Their policy of shooting at any approaching foreign ships was quickly scrapped and they allowed for refueling. But Japan wasn't ready to open up just yet, because when an account of the Opium War was spread in Japan, the author and illustrator were arrested for inciting social unrest. But the pressure to open up just kept mounting, internally and externally. Throughout the Sakoku period, various countries have tried to get Japan to open up for trade. The British, Russian, French, Americans, and so on. But then, in 1849, the American captain James Glynn had a breakthrough. Quite literally. He forced his way into Nagasaki through a row of boats and demanded the return of 15 shipwrecked whalers who were imprisoned. He got what he demanded and returned unscathed. This was perhaps one of the earliest examples of a gaijin smash. And this successful negotiation led him to recommend the US Congress to open up Japan with a show of force. So in turn, the Perry expedition happened. In 1853, when Matthew Perry started shooting blank cannon rounds at the entrance of Edo Bay to threaten Japan to open up, the Japanese official who negotiated with Perry brought with him a translator named Hori Tatsunosuke, who said, "I can speak Dutch." And that was the beginning of the end of Rangaku. After the signing of the Convention of Kanagawa, Japan signed a series of treaties with other Western countries over the next few years, and Rangaku was no longer their only window to the West. In due course, the focus on the Dutch language was shifted to English, and it became the Age of Yogaku, the study of the West. Technically, it is the study of any Western knowledge that is not Dutch. Not long after, in 1867, the Tokugawa shogunate fell and gave way to the Meiji era, and Japan experienced its Industrial Revolution. But that's a history for another time. By the way, if you like this kind of cool history, then make sure to subscribe, because we've got plenty more contents like this coming up. If you like what we're doing, then you can also support us on Patreon. Until next time, stay cool, my bros.